Today we're going to discuss about the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. What is the Great Flood of 1927? The Mississippi Flood of 1927 was one of America's worst natural disasters. After 6 months of record rainstorm has swollen the Mississippi River's two main tributaries, the Ohio and Missouri rivers, and saturated the river basin. The first of 145 breaches in the levees released a wall of water on April 16, 1927 in Illinois. The wall of water would eventually cover a total of 27,000 square miles across Illinois, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Missouri, and worst of all, Arkansas. The flood caused over $400 million in damage and about $5 billion in today's dollars, and 246 deaths in 7 states. Over 130,000 homes were lost and the flood displaced 700,000 people. These included African Americans who eventually migrated north and was part of the social and political changes in our country that I will discuss later. This shows the map of the flooded areas. This is a picture of the levees being breached. What caused the flooding? The flood of 1927 has its origins both in nature and in man. In the late 1920s, technological advances kept pace with the growing economy. Heavy machinery enabled the construction of vast systems of levees to hold back rivers that tended to overrun their banks. Drainage projects opened up new low-lying lands that had once been forests but had left bare by the timber industries. Feeling protected from flooding by the levees, farmers borrowed money with easy credit from the banks booming with the record levels of the stock markets. They expanded their fields to low-lying areas on their own property or moved to new lands that were fertile from centuries of seasonal floodings. They felt safe behind these levees and secure in selling their crops to new markets now accessible by railroads, trucks, automobiles, and even international shipping. The spring of 1927 saw warm weathers and early snowmelts in Canada, causing the upper Mississippi to swell. Rain fell in the upper Midwest, sending its four rivers gushing into the already swollen Mississippi. Its destination, the Gulf of Mexico, acted as a stopper when it too became full. Then in the south it began to rain. When the water level rises across the river banks or dams, floods will occur. Having no trees because of the timber industries caused different water levels below and on the ground. With the ground saturated with water, the water could not drain, and this caused the water to flow on the surface. The western edge of the Mississippi Delta is outlined by the river along with man-made levees to protect the valuable farmlands from the river overflows. The rainfall steadily filled upstream creeks and ditches in the Delta region and saturated the farmlands. As the water rose in the Mississippi River, levees broke in several states. In some places, the residential areas were submerged by 30 feet of water. It took nearly 2 months before the floodwater completely subsided. This shows a picture of the flooded areas. Long-term and social political changes. There were racial and socio-economic ramifications. Out-of-the-state emergency workers clashed with local health officials, and large planters over the extent and types of aid and to whom such aid should go to. In some places, the Red Cross distributed aid directly to the victims, but in others, so as not to challenge the plantation system, relief supplies were given to the large planters, who were then in charge of distributing them to the sharecroppers. Similar to the Haiti relief efforts, no one was in charge and no one stopped aid from the different agencies, so the aid was disorganized. Planters feared that the sharecroppers, both black and white, might not return home from the Red Cross camps. This led to controversial mandate in which sharecroppers, particularly black planters, Some were forced at gunpoint by the law enforcement officials to survive on the levees, indefinitely in makeshift tents as water rose around them. They were forced by the National Guard with fixed bayonets to work on these levees. Many of the African Americans took the opportunity to escape to cities like Chicago, bringing their stories of the flood and breaking levees to enrich the traditions of blues music. Those left in the camps were mistreated. This shows the African Americans living on these levees. The flood of 1927 took place when the rest of the country was enjoying the peak of the Roaring Twenties prosperity. In Washington, D.C., the federal response under President Calvin Coolidge to the flooded South was simple. Not $1 of the federal money went to the flood victims. Similar to the Haiti, when the president did not show himself for days, Coolidge did not visit the flooded areas. In April 1927, Herbert Hoover, Commerce Secretary, was appointed as the official to lead the rescue and the relief efforts. He coordinated efforts to rescue 330,000 people from rooftops and other high places. The flood of 1927 brought Hoover into the spotlight, laying the groundwork for his successful presidential campaign. The flood of 1927 brought about a political shift, especially among African Americans. Those who had traditionally favored the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, represented the Republican response, or lack of response, and shifted their allegiance to the Democratic Party. The 1927 flood also led to the change in attitudes regarding the government's role in helping the citizens in times of crisis. Prior to this time, people preferred work to charity. However, the enormity of the catastrophe led many to support the types of New Deal programs proposed by Franklin Roosevelt, Democratic administration in 1932. People now looked to Washington for help. As in most disasters, the 1927 flood saw the best and the worst of humanity. Of the 1927 flood, author John M. Barry says in his Rising Tide book, their struggle began as one of the man's against nature. It became one of man's against man. Honor and money collided. Whites and blacks collided. Regional and national power structures collided. The collision shook America. What did we learn and what was the response? Out of the Great Flood grew the Flood Control Act of 1928, which gave the federal government authority over the containment of the Mississippi River. Looking back in the spring of 1927, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers assured the public that these levees would hold since the Corps had built them. The Corps overestimated its own ability and underestimated the power of the river. The Corps built the levee system to confine the river. They represented man's power over nature. If necessary, it was thought the flow would be reduced with outlets that would divert part of the river into several rivers and then into the Gulf. To prevent floods, cutoffs were proposed to straighten and speed the river. The concentration of the river's force would lower the bed so the river would be faster and carry more water. By such correction, floods could be permanently lowered. But no cutoffs were dug, nor were there ideas to build reservoirs on their tributaries to hold back the water. Also, no outlets were dug. The Corps engineers relied on levees only. The Corps raised the heights of the levees from 2 feet to 7.5 feet to as much as 38 feet. The Corps was confident that the levees only system would hold the rivers, and so it promised. The levees failed, and the river undercut the levees and the water poured through breaks. In 1928, in reaction to the Great Flood of 1927, Congress put into place the Jadwin Plan. The Corps of Engineers called the system Project Flood and assured the public that the changes would protect the lower Mississippi River from a flood bigger than the 1927 flood. The Jadwin Plan, still in place, set standards for levees far higher and thicker than those of 1927. In addition, the Corps built reservoirs called lakes on the tributaries. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Corps created cutoffs that shortened the river by more than 150 miles by eliminating a series of sharp curves called the Greenville Bends. These cutoffs lowered the flood's heights. Further south, the Corps built the old river control structures. These structures, made of concrete and steel, are used to divert 600,000 cubic feet per second from the Mississippi River to the other rivers. In 1963, the Corps built a massive dam to seal off the natural flow between the rivers. Whether that will work or not, it is still to be seen. Many engineers are convinced the rivers will shift. The river not manned will decide in many places. It has rejected the cutoffs built more than half a century ago. The river has today regained one-third of these cutoffs. The struggle between nature and man continues. It will last as long as humans inhabit the North America and as long as the rain continues to fall. In the end, whether that happens, the river will always win. Nature will always win, and the river will make its own route to the Gulf of Mexico. Thank you.